Everyone, I'm Bruce Karask, co-founder of the Jewish Republican Alliance. We're so happy to have Evan Sayet here with us today. We'll be speaking with Evan in just a few minutes, but first, more historic news today from the President Trump White House. Fox News is reporting that President Trump oversaw the signing of an historic agreement this morning between Serbia and Kosovo that normalizes relations between those two countries. But what's also great is the deal includes Kosovo recognizing Israel and Serbia moving its embassy to Jerusalem. This is another big diplomacy victory for the Trump administration. Kosovo, mainly a Muslim country, had not recognized Israel before now. This comes after the historic deal that the Trump administration just brokered weeks ago between the United Arab Emirates and Israel, where they normalized relations between the two countries. We had some good news on the economic front today. It was reported that the US economy added 1.4 million jobs, and that this is all in August, and the unemployment rate dropped to 8.4% from a high of 14.7% in April. You know, to me, it's so sad to see Democrats closing down the country and then campaigning on high unemployment. It just doesn't make sense. How they're able to look at themselves in the mirror, I don't understand it at all. There's also some other good news. There's rumors that there could be a vaccine for the coronavirus as soon as October, as well as other cures or therapeutics. It could be the October surprise. I know that would make the country very happy, but I think it would make Democrats very sad. I predict that you will be hearing from the Democrats once this vaccine is released, that it's being rushed, that they have to approve it on a state level first. And even though this started months ago when President Trump started Operation Warp Speed, where he mobilized private industry to make this historic feat happen. So we're hoping it happens in October. That would be great for all of us. As you may recall, I called out Joe Biden after the Democrat convention for having anti-Semite Linda Sarsour speak at the convention. And after Biden got harsh criticism, then he suddenly decided to distance himself from Linda Sarsour, even though we knew exactly what he was doing all along. But what was not widely reported that I read this week is that World Israel News reported that Biden's top campaign aides, after they distanced themselves from Sarsour, met with Arab and Muslim activists and apologized to these groups for the Biden administration, or not their administration, but their campaign, distancing themselves from Linda Sarsour. So which way you're going to have it? You want her to speak, then you say you want to distance yourself from her, then you go back and say, well, we really didn't mean it. We're sorry, we apologize for distancing ourselves from her. And then yesterday, Biden did it again. He went ahead and aligned himself with Jacob Blake Sr., who is the father of Jacob Blake, who was shot while he was resisting arrest, and he was reaching for a knife. And it is very clear from Jacob Blake Sr.'s comments that he is really an anti-Semite. It's clear to me that Joe Biden is not a friend of Jews and Israel, and that President Trump is the greatest friend of Jews and Israel in my lifetime. So much to cover. So glad you're all here today. And now I'd like to introduce fellow co-founder Mitch Silberman. Mitch.
Hello, JRA community. It's always so great when we are together. Some of you may be aware that I was a child actor, which is probably why I love movies so much. And whenever I get together with friends, we discuss the greatest comedies of all time. Invariably, two come up: Blazing Saddles and Airplane. And then we all lament those films could not be made today. What a shame that would be to rob millions of people of that joy and laughter. Well, sadly, I have another film to add to that list. It's a film I've seen multiple times, like you probably have as well, but this time I was looking at it with 20/20 vision. Yes, all puns intended. The film is 48 hours, and I was stunned, but not offended, at the language used in that film. In particular, the way that Nick Nolte, the cop, spoke to Eddie Murphy, the convict. He hurled every racial epithet in the book at him, up to and including the N-word. And I'm thinking, did Black people not see this film? Well, of course they did. That was 1982. It was a blockbuster film, and it helped catapult Eddie Murphy into superstardom. So what happened? How come no one was offended? How come they weren't triggered? They weren't upset. They weren't outraged. They weren't screaming. They weren't boycotting. Well, what was going on? Okay, well, what happened then to now? And what about all the people that made the film? What about fellow actors, the stuntmen, the editors, the writers, director, producers, the grip, the lighting, the sound people? Surely they all heard that language. How come they weren't outraged? How come they weren't boycotting? How come they didn't cause a ruckus? So how did we get from there to today? What is going on today? And what can you do about it? Well, I am so glad you asked those questions, because we have a true expert with us today, someone who is going to talk about this and other important topics. Now, I've known Evan the better part of 2 decades. And when I first met him, I said, my goodness, what a talented stand-up comedian, an insightful guy, and very funny man. And then we launched the Jewish Republican Alliance back when we could meet in person. And I said, hey, Evan, would you please speak live at a few of our events? And I said, on top of everything else, he's an intellectual and he's an author. So you are in for a real treat today. And I'm going to actually introduce Evan right now, give him a full introduction that he deserves. Evan is a speaker, author, columnist, political comedian, campaign advisor, speechwriter, and contributor. Evan's new book, which I'm reading right now, is superb, called The Woke Supremacy, an Anti-Socialist Manifesto, has been compared to Thomas Paine's Common Sense and provides the definition, history, and explanation of the woke ideology, just as it quite literally is bursting onto the scene. Evan, welcome.
Oh, all right, there we are. Hey, Mitch, how are you?
Excellent.
Hey, everybody.
So glad to have
Evan,
you.
so glad you're here today. Evan has been such a good friend of the JRA and a good friend to both Mitch and I. Evan, you know, I have read part of your book. I wonder if you would tell, it's a great book, it's called The Woke Supremacy. I wonder if you could tell our audience a little bit about it, why you wrote it, and the thesis behind the book.
Right. You know, in Mitch's introduction just now, he was kind enough to list so many of the different things that I do. My career is what I call the conservative thought industry. And I deliver my thoughts in any number of varying ways. I do it through articles, I do it through speeches, I do it through writing speeches for other people, I do it through political humor. The least satisfying, that's the wrong word, but it's so much work to write a book. It's my least favorite way of delivering my thoughts. But nonetheless, I was sitting home watching the riots break out, and I was listening to the pundits, and I was listening to the politicians, and I was even listening to the participants, and none of them seemed to know who and what the woke are. And you know, the first rule of warfare is know thy enemy. And nobody seemed to know who the woke are, where they came from, what they want, what they're willing to do to get it, and most terrifyingly of all, what it's likely to befall mankind if somehow they were to win. And so I remembered Thomas Paine's Common Sense was a very short book. I mean, it was a pamphlet, it was about 50 pages. But there was another book, Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was serialized in newspapers. And these 2 books, these 2 efforts, they solidified, they gave moral solidity to the issues just prior to, in the case of Uncle Tom's Cabin, the Civil War, and in the case of Common Sense, the Revolutionary War. And if we are to go to war, I felt we needed a book that gave moral clarity to what the issue is, who the enemy is, what it is they want, and what it is we have to do to stop them and why.
Excellent. Evan, obviously the people we see rioting in the streets, we're not going to communicate with them. But how would you coach our audience on how to best communicate with friends and family that are in part of this woke crowd? We would love to get some guidance from you on that.
Yeah, I mean, they're in any movement, there are about 10% who are the true believers. In Nazi Germany, only about 10% were actual Nazis, and the other were what I call supremacist enablers. You know, in the Deep South, when the Democrats ran the Deep South, only about 10% perhaps were members of the KKK or true believers in white supremacy. The rest were just so heavily steeped in the narratives and the orthodoxies of those supremacies, and just as importantly, were prevented from hearing any alternative point of view that they simply repeated without even giving it a moment's thought, those narratives and those orthodoxies. I mean, I tell a story, or I use as an example in the Woke Supremacy, Bruce Springsteen's song about the Vietnam War, Born in the USA. Now, I don't think Bruce Springsteen is a Marxist. I don't believe he's a supremacist. I don't believe he's an ideologue in any way. Yet in the song, he gives a lyric that describes the cause of the Vietnam War. He says, got in a little hometown jam, so they put a rifle in my hand, sent me off to a foreign land to go and kill the yellow man. Right? So to Springsteen and what he's presenting to the rest of the world is the idea that America is a viciously racist nation, so racist, in fact, that we would either go ourselves or send our sons and daughters to this godforsaken jungle halfway around the world to die, be wounded, but in order to kill people whose skin color is different. My God, that's a god-awful accusation to make. And if it were true, then so much of what the woke believe about America being evil and racist would be true. The problem is, not only is it not true, but it is so obviously untrue that Springsteen had to have known it. He possessed the knowledge necessary to not make that accusation. Because yes, of course it's true that the North Vietnamese, the people we were fighting against, had yellow skin. But it's equally true that so too did the people of South Vietnam with whom we were fighting and who we were fighting for. So clearly Springsteen didn't feel the need to give this narrative that he had been surrounded by and that he had been steeped in and that he had never had challenged during his upbringing in subsequent years as you know, an East Coast elitist. So the first thing that we have to do is start introducing the truth to people. And this is one thing that the left is very, very good at, is cowing us, is scaring us, is intimidating us, whether it's physically on the streets as they're doing right now, whether it's professionally as they do in my industry, the entertainment industry, or in academia. And you know, the reason that Hitler put the Jews in ghettos before moving on to the final solution was so that the Jews couldn't counter the narratives of the supremacy with their humanity. They wouldn't have been able to get to that final solution if they hadn't first put Jews into ghettos. The reason that slavery was able to remain an institution for so long in the Democratic Party controlled South was because they segregated Black and white children from each other so that Blacks couldn't counter the narrative the Democrats were using to portray Blacks as inferior and to justify slavery. Well, we cannot allow them to intellectually ghettoize us. They do so by shadow banning us. They do so by putting us in Facebook jail. They do so by firing us from our jobs or not hiring us or producing the materials that we produce. But we don't have to, in our day-to-day interaction, agree to be ghettoized. We need to speak up. We need to present our case. We need to present our humanity in every opportunity that is presented to us, because they own the media. They own the indoctrination process, the schools and the universities. They own social communications. But guys, we own the truth. And while they can be they can be one person, a Rosie O'Donnell or a Springsteen or whomever, hitting 1 million people at once, we've got to be 1 million people talking to our neighbors one at a time.
Evan, I'm trying to figure out the Biden campaign. So first, I wonder if you wouldn't mind commenting on this. First, after months of denying that there was any widespread violence in the streets, his poll numbers drop, and then suddenly he's acknowledging that there's violence in the street. But now the violence, President Trump his supporters' fault. He is now putting out an ad that says that it's even dangerous for African Americans to go out on the street just by living their lives, they may even die just by living their lives. And I don't think he's talking about inner city violence, because he won't even talk about that. He's most likely talking about racism or police brutality. He is accusing President Trump of fanning the flames, and this constant barrage of saying that it's dangerous and people are going to be killed and America is a racist country is making people angrier and angrier. So I don't understand any of it. I wonder if you wouldn't mind commenting.
Right. Well, you understand it. First of all, there's no moral basis to what a supremacy does. Everything in a supremacy is for the cause. And so Biden, and if you go back through his entire career, how he has flip-flopped on every single issue. There's nothing that he holds dear. There is nothing that he considers sacred, nor is there anything that he considers beyond the pale. This, again, it requires, therefore, for Black Republicans to go out and show their humanity and make clear that this is not, they're not cowering in their basements. And in fact, I was on the radio earlier today on Andrew Wilko's show, and Stacey Washington was filling in. And this was the point that she made over and over again, that this does not describe her life. And you know, these cases are not, Biden is not making this case to the Black community. They know whether they're afraid or not. They know what's happening in their neighborhoods. They know that it's not the police who are gunning down innocent people. It's the Democrats, it's Antifa, it's the supremacist movement that is burning down their businesses, that are killing people on the streets, that are destroying their livelihood and their dreams. It's actually to the white suburban and typically white suburban female that they are making their case. People who don't tend to know a lot of Blacks and certainly don't tend to know what's going on in the inner cities. And so once again, it's our opportunity. It's the last opportunity that we have before we get to violence, to fight back, which is to communicate one-on-one, know your facts. For example, the number of unarmed Blacks who were shot by the police, were killed by the police last year was 15, 1-5. That's a minuscule number. And by the way, unarmed doesn't mean not dangerous. And it's truly striking, and I believe this strikes the Black community as well, that none of these people were acting lawfully and were just gunned down as they lied. And by the way, Joe Biden and Elizabeth Warren continue to lie about what happened to Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. Right? None of them were sweet, gentle giants who were gunned down in cold blood while begging for their lives. Every one of them. And this is something that the Black community themselves know. You know, there's a line, and it is in fact in the book, The Woke Supremacy, from Saul Alinsky. And he says, it's up to us to go in and rub raw the sores of discontent. There's so much packed into that line right there. It's up to us. What an elitist idea that it is up to somebody else to influence and tell us what it is we're supposed to do. It's up to us, but here's the key line, to go in, all right? Alinsky and the people who are fanning these flames are not the people who live in those communities. The people who live in those communities want more police. They don't want the police defunded. The people who live in those communities don't want criminals on the streets, whatever their color. They don't want no bail so that after they've committed a crime in the neighborhood, they return to the neighborhood. This is all typically rich white elitists, typically rich white coastal elitists, people like Christopher Cuomo and Alyssa Milano, and who have absolutely no interaction and truly don't care about the Black community. It's just what they do because these are the rules for overthrowing a government, which Alinsky then called the radicals.
So Evan, I have to ask, what do you think that these woke individuals, these woke folks will do if, as we all pray, President Trump wins in November?
Look, I think in the end, there's going to be a certain degree of violence. The question is how much violence? And the most terrifying thing of all is if this violence is conducted with the full power and authority of the United States government behind it. If the Democrats were to win, look, they've already declared war against us in numerous ways. And by the way, not just subtly, but literally outright. You know, the woke are really the spawn of the 60s radicals, of the radicals of the 1960s. And these were truly disgusting, evil, and I do believe mentally ill people like William Ayres and Bernardine Dorn, Mark Rudd and Jerry Rubin. These were murderers, these were kidnappers, these were rapists, these were cop killers. These were people who sought to foment a revolution. And in fact, Bernardine Dorn, one of the original terrorists of William Ayres' Weather Underground, by the way, at the very first meeting of the Weather Underground in Flint, Michigan in 1969, they took a moment to cheer Charles Manson for his murders. These were bloodthirsty people who sought revolution, and Bernardine Dorn approached a bank of microphones that was set up for her, and she said, "Hi, I'm Bernardine Dorn, and I'm going to read to you a declaration of war." And they sought war from the very beginning, and what they applauded about Charles Manson was not just the viciousness and just the heinousness of his crimes, but helter-skelter. We older folk will remember that phrase. What he meant by that was a race war. Charles Manson sought to start a race war, and that's what the Democrats have been trying to do ever since. What happened was the revolution in the 60s failed. And the reason it failed is they couldn't find any grown-ups, anybody from the last of the great generations, people who knew the real world. People who had fled socialism from Germany, Hitler's socialism. People who had fled socialism from Russia, Stalin's socialism. And people who had gone over and given up years of their lives to fight in the trenches and in the most horrific of conditions in order to beat back Hitler's socialism. And when they returned to America, they had no interest in overthrowing America. They knew America was great. Right? They understood great doesn't mean perfect. And they understood that flawed doesn't mean failed. But the attitude that these radicals were up against was typified, and this story's in the book, The Woke Supremacy, as well. It comes from Muhammad Ali, the great boxer Muhammad Ali, who went over to Africa to train for his big fight in Zaire. And remember, this was a black man from the still Democratic Party-controlled South who had long before already converted to Islam. Right? So this was a black Muslim man from the South. And they said to him when he returned, "Muhammad, what'd you think of Africa?" And Muhammad Ali said, quote, "Thank God my granddaddy got on that boat." And so when the radicals who sought to destroy America, as they do today, couldn't find people to join them, they went on what everybody knows as the long march through the institutions. They segued into and they took over the schools, sometimes at gunpoint. They put guns to the heads of Columbia University presidents and other schools as well. They took over the education system and academia and turned it into their ministry of indoctrination. They took over news and entertainment and turned it into their ministry of propaganda. Now they have the ministry of social communications. And over the next 30 years or so, they use these weapons, they use these tools to indoctrinate people who didn't know the real world. In fact, because of the successes of the last of the great generations in vanquishing all sorts of diseases, polio, smallpox, chickenpox, et cetera, in literally creating machinery that now competed with the human brain, in building the roads and infrastructure in America, and creating a system called NASA, which meant that from that point on, never again would the sky even be the limit. But these children who knew nothing about the real world were easily indoctrinated into the mindset and the teachings and what I call the narratives and the orthodoxies of the radicals who had taken over the schools, etc. And so Mark Rudd, another bloodthirsty person who along with William Ayres incited children to murder their parents. And he then went on to be a college professor teaching the same things. You know, William Ayres was asked long after he'd segued from terrorist to a more managerial position in the supremacy as a professor, he was asked, "Do you regret the bombings?" And he said, "Not only don't I regret the bombings, I wish we had done more." And he incited children. He said, bring the revolution home, kill your parents. And Mark Rudd, I believe it was Mark Rudd, it might have been Jerry Rubin, said, until you are ready to murder your parents, you're not ready to change the world. And Mark Rudd said the true flowering of the 60s will come in the 90s when we've taken over the institutions. Well, he was wrong only because he missed the obvious. Once they'd taken over the institutions, they would need another 30 years to use those institutions to brainwash successive generations of radicals. And so, guys, if from the 60s to the 90s is 30 years, what's 30 years from the 90s? Now, all right, this is why if it seems like they've come out of nowhere, that this hate that we're seeing on the street, where did it come from? If the violence, if the destruction, if the rhetoric, if the hatred for cops, if the cop killing seems to have come out of nowhere, it hasn't come out of nowhere. This plan that they've had for 60 years has simply come to fruition. They now have their warriors they couldn't get from the grown-ups. So they created what I call in my other book, the Kindergarten of Eden. They created generations, successive generations of children who simply are so steeped in the narrative and the orthodoxies and who have never heard any alternative point of view. And this is why they're now using the same language. They didn't call themselves socialists 5 years ago, 10 years ago. They're calling themselves socialists now because they believe that their armies are now ready to fight. They, even 4 or 8 years ago, Barack Obama still felt the need to be somewhat tricky and call it fundamental change. Bernie Sanders doesn't call it fundamental change. The thugs on the streets don't call it fundamental change. They call it what it is and what they called it back in the 60s, revolution.
Evan, I see a storm coming in November. The last close election we had was Bush-Gore in 2000. Everybody remembers the hanging chads, and it went a couple of weeks, and we really didn't know how that was going to turn out until the Supreme Court finally ruled. And now we have the threat of possible 80 million ballots that are going to be mailed in. I call it cheat by mail. And my concern is, unless this is just a totally one-sided election, which I don't foresee, that we're going to see lawsuit after lawsuit and maybe not even know a winner for weeks or months to come, and maybe even create a major problem. How do we navigate through this?
Yeah, it won't even matter. Look, this last election wasn't even really close. There were no lawsuits. She conceded, at least by phone, that evening. And still, instantly, they rejected the result. They called themselves, and this is another declaration of war, they called themselves the resistance to the duly elected government of the United States of America. Right? They call it's really the only way that I see limited bloodshed, lesser bloodshed of all the options, is an overwhelming Trump and Republican victory. The far left needs to be so overwhelmingly repudiated that the prostitutional left, all right, that's who I call the Nancy Pelosi's and the Chuck Schumers and the two Clintons and probably even Biden, people who have actually no moral, they're not far leftists. All right, they are people who stick their finger in the wind. And a few years ago, when America was more centrist, they were more centrist. And as America and at least the Democratic Party has gone further and further left, they've gone further and further left in order to hold on to their positions, in order to hold on to their prestige, in order to hold on to their salaries, in order to hold on to the perks. And so the far left is overwhelmingly repudiated in this election, not just at the top, across the board. They will have to finally jettison the left. You know, right now, Pelosi is kowtowing to the squad. I mean, there was one moment in time where she tried to stand up to them, and they did what they do. They called her a racist, and instantly she backed down, and now the entire party is controlled by the radical left. If it turns out they don't have that power, they aren't the future, and they are repudiated massively in this election, they lose that. Plus, they lose the prostitutional Democrats who will have to come further to the center, perhaps even to a place where they had been many years ago where they were even pro-American. Anything short of that, if it's close, the left isn't going to concede, and they're simply going to use the same violence and intimidation tactics that supremacies always use. All right, it was necessary for the white supremacists in the Democratic Party-controlled South to have the KKK. It was essential to the supremacists, the German supremacists, Nazi Germany, to have the brown shirts. All right, they are going to continue to use Antifa as a means of intimidation, because socialism and supremacies simply cannot rule by consensus. They cannot rule by compromise. They cannot rule by agreement, by definition. Supremacies can, and socialists are by definition supremacists. Anybody who thinks that therefore that their ideology should control not only everybody in the entire country, but in reality, socialism is a globalist system. You know, one of the key points, one of the most essential points that I bring to the book, The Woke Supremacy, that you don't find necessarily in other books about socialism, is that most people think of socialism as an ideology. It's not. It's a economic system and a structure, a government structure that any number of ideologies can then employ. For example, Marxism wasn't Leninism, wasn't Stalinism, wasn't Maoism, wasn't Hitlerism, and it's not democratic socialism. If you want to know about the ideology of the woke, go back and read my earlier book, The Kindergarten of Eden, How the Modern Liberal Thinks. But any regime is comprised of two parts. One is the ideology, and two is the economic system and the global and the government model that ideology then employs. And every socialist ideology has said that these three things are the requisites for the utopia, the globalist utopia that all of them promise. Right? We always think of, when we think of socialism, we think of the atrocities of Hitler, and we think of the atrocities of Stalin and Lenin, we think of the killing fields of Mao and so on, and we associate it with those evil, bad people. So let's look at the nicest socialist who has ever lived. Okay, and by the way, John Lennon wasn't a socialist. The protagonist of this song is a socialist. But the nicest guy in the history of the world with the woke vision of peace and love and understanding. The three requisites for socialism from Marxism till today are that there be no personal possessions, no property, no possessions, no countries, and no religions. The idea as the woke see it is that without possessions, we'll all just share. Without possessions, there won't be any greed. There won't be any fighting over ownership. There'll just be peace, love, and understanding. Without countries, there won't be any wars because there won't be any fight for glory or for treasure. There won't be any xenophobia. And without God, without religion, there'll be no fighting over who God really sides with and again, for the glory of God. The reality, though, is without these three things, these three requisites for paradise are also the three requisites for the authoritarianism and the totalitarianism that socialism has never yet once failed to bring, no matter the ideology. And keep in mind, all of them were utopian ideologies. Socialism is, by its definition, a utopian ideology. You and I might disagree, and I hope we do, with what others thought was the perfect world. I mean, Marx and Lenin and Stalin thought the perfect world was one with only the workers in it. Hitler thought the perfect world was the one with only Aryans in it. The woke think the perfect world is the world with only the woke in it. But the authoritarian and the totalitarianism comes from the fact that without possessions, the individual does not have the resources to stand up to an oppressive government. Without countries, then there are no other nations with armies strong enough to oppose the globalists' totalitarian rule. And without religion, there's no moral basis, no moral foundation to countermand the globalists' every dictate, no matter how immoral they may be. And so while in the imaginations of the woke and the Nazis and the Stalinists and the Leninists and the Maoists, there's always got to be this middle part. And Marx knew this. He called it the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is authoritarian, totalitarian, and brutal. And brutal. You know, and when Lenin says that his vision is for all the people to live as one, well, that was Hitler's vision too. The only difference is who the one was. That was Marx's vision too. The only difference was who the one was. And if you're going to create a world where all the people live as one, all of the others have to in some way be dealt with.
Excellent, Evan. You hinted at my next question. So far, my favorite book of yours is The Kindergarten of Eden. And I think it's very relevant.
That's because you haven't finished this one yet.
That's what I said so far. Before we go to, we have a lot of questions in the audience they want to go to, but I think it's very relevant if you talk a little bit about The Kindergarten of Eden and the thinking behind that and why it was such a profound book, in my opinion.
Right. You know, when I gave my original speech to the Heritage Foundation, which catapulted me into the world of the conservative thinker, you know, which introduced me to Washington and led to all the other gigs that came along the way, I started to get emails, and there was this phrase that kept popping up, and it was so odd because it's an odd phrase. And yet I would say literally 10, 15, maybe even 20 times over the years, people would say, you know what you have there? You've got the unified field theory of liberalism. Once you understand what I delivered in that original speech, you understood everything about why the modern liberal sides with evil over good, wrong over right, ugly over beautiful, profane over profound, and failure over success. And so when a couple of years later, I decided to turn this into a book finally, I decided to do it almost as a scientific formula, the unified field theory of liberalism. And I laid out 4 laws and 3 corollaries. And truly to understand it for our purposes tonight, because this isn't about that book, I'll just give you the first 2 laws. And I'll give it to you as written in the book, and then I'll explain. The first law is that the modern liberal, that's anybody born after World War II, the babies born after World War II, who became the children of the 60s, who became the powers that be in academia and journalism and entertainment and now social communications in the 80s and 90s, and growing worse with each successive generation. The modern liberal was raised to believe that indiscriminateness is a moral imperative because its opposite is discrimination. Let me explain. In the 1980s, right, when the children of the 60s became the powers that be, thinking was outlawed. It was deemed to be a hate crime. The thinking behind the outlawing of thinking is this. Anything you believe, Mitch, anything that I believe, anything that Bruce believes, anything that the other 123 people in the room believe, anything that anybody believes is going to have been so tainted by your personal prejudices. Prejudices we all have, can't help but have just as being human beings from our experiences and our upbringing. Anything that you believe is going to have been so tainted by your personal prejudices that the only way not to be a bigot was to never think at all. The second law, and because with that first law, you would just think their conclusions would be random. Sometimes they'd be on the side of right, sometimes they'd be on the side of wrong. Why are they always on the side of evil, failure, and wrong? That's the second law. I'm going to try to recall it. It's been a while since I've looked at the book. But the second law is that indiscriminateness of thought does not lead to indiscriminateness of convictions. It leads invariably and inevitably to siding with evil over good, wrong over right, ugly over beautiful. Why? Because if nothing is better than anything else, if no country, if no constitution, if no religion, if no form of governance, if no behavior, if nothing is better than anything else, then success is unjust. Why should a person, a country, a religion, a familial construct, why should something succeed if it's not better than anything else? For the same reason, just in the inverse, failure, as proved by nothing other than the fact that it has failed, is proof positive that somehow the failure has been victimized. After all, why should a person, a culture, a religion, a nation, why should it fail if it's not worse than anything else? And then simply by extension, the greater the success and the greater the failure, the greater the injustice simply must have been. And let's go back to our example of Bruce Springsteen, all right, and the song Born in the USA. Springsteen wasn't allowed to take a moment to think because his thinking would reflect his prejudices. So he had to start and end his consideration of the issue by saying that communism and capitalism, the Soviet Union and the United States, are equally good and equally right. Therefore, it couldn't be over the form of governance that we were fighting. So without that, the only explanation that he could have is racism and bigotry and discrimination, because the opposite of indiscriminateness is the evil of having discriminated.
Evan, you
Yes,
had talked about, and I want to follow up on your comments about repudiating the left to have a clear decision in the election. My concern is that that would be a lot easier of a task if the left was actually hearing some things that they need to know to make a really good decision. For example, this guy, his name is Jacob Blake Sr. And I heard last night a little bit about this guy. I heard that he said he's with Farrakhan 100%. He called white people crackers. He had a picture of Jesus in a toilet bowl floating.
And I think he's a little bit anti-Semitic too.
Yeah, he said, you also go to that. He said that the Jewish residents in Pittsburgh are participating in a conspiracy to fake their own persecution. He said Jewish people in Pittsburgh got advance warning of the attack on the synagogue. I mean, he called Jews pink-footed, I don't know what else, something like that. He called them pink-toed Jews, also like making them into pigs. So Joe Biden goes there and hails this guy as the civil rights leader, and the media doesn't cover all the rest of this.
No.
So how do you repudiate a group who doesn't hear the truth?
Yeah, again, it's got to be one drip at a time. It's got to be one seed planted at a time, and then somebody else has to come along and water it. It's not going to be, I'm going to lecture you and I'm going to present you with the facts and you're going to change. In fact, in response to a similar question when the other book came out, The Kindergarten of Eden, I created a pseudo program I call Adopt a Democrat. See, one of the mistakes we make is trying to, we think we're dealing with adults who are both knowledgeable and willing to think. And they're not. They're very much like children. So you've got to find one person in your life, and it's important that they be a person in your life, a relative, a longtime colleague, a longtime neighbor, a longtime friend, somebody who just makes it that much more difficult for them to call you a Nazi or for them to dehumanize you the way that the left does in order to dismiss us. And over the course of time, you plant the seed and then you move on. You don't have to win every battle today. In fact, we won't. It's like being a parent who makes everything a teachable moment. Well, you know what happens is your child rebels, your child despises you, and you have no input into their lives. So when you have an opportunity to point something like this out, maybe even show them the video, don't then try to say, are you a Republican now? Go on to something else, move on to something else. Over the course of time, and I know because I have converted many, many people, and I know how daunting it is to look at the media and go, how can we possibly make a change when they have so much power? Well, keep in mind that while they own the media and we own the truth, if all of us just change one person, we double our numbers. We don't have to change the world today. We just need to all go out and commit ourselves to changing one person. Some of it will be immediate. Some of them are already seeing it. Some of them, when I first attended, my history. I grew up as a New York City born liberal Jew. I thought that meant that I was a Democrat. As our friend Andrew Breitbart would say, it was just the default factory setting for somebody born into my demographics. And when, after 9/11 and the liberal response to the attacks, and I realized this is not a liberal position to be championing the Islamic fascist mass murderers. If that is a liberal position, I'm not a liberal. And I went and I found a group in the San Fernando Valley near where I was living. And I went to my first Republican meeting expecting to disagree with them on everything. But it didn't matter because that one thing at that moment was the only thing that mattered. It didn't matter where you stood on abortion if everybody was dead because Islamic fascism had taken over. It didn't matter where you stood on border security if you were dead. And that's where we are right now is it doesn't really matter where you stand on these issues if America is destroyed. And so, but it dawned on me when I walked into that room, two things dawned on me. One, as I listened to Gary Aminoff and the other speakers there, it was the first time in my life I was hearing from a Republican what Republicans believe. Up until then, I had only heard what Republicans believe from Democrats, whether it was my liberal rabbi at the Reform Synagogue, or whether it was my liberal professor, or whether it was my liberal Jewish neighbor, or whether when I moved out to Hollywood, it was my colleagues and my coworkers. When I walked into that room and I heard from a Republican for the first time what a Republican believes, it was very, very different than the narrative that I had been provided with. And there was another thing that struck me at that exact moment. I was hearing something as I stayed rather quiet. I know you find that hard to believe, but it was my first day. And I listened as they went around the room. And I recognized I was hearing something I had never heard before. I heard people who could give affirmative reasons for the things they believed. I had never heard this at a Democratic gathering or even at a dinner or just a handful of us. Every Democratic Party argument is, of course we destroy your cities. Of course we've destroyed your schools. Of course we're all these, but hey, look over there. Republicans are Nazis. Everything that came from their side was about how bad and even unhuman we were. And once again, that requires us to humanize ourselves by being there, by being present, by being outspoken. And over time, you will convert people, you will change people. You know, one more thought. I often think about it as being in a cave. I know I'm not the first to have thought of this, but being in a cave. And they've told you your whole life, there's nothing outside but darkness. There's nothing outside but darkness. There's not, and you believed it. You've been steeped in that narrative. You've been steeped in that orthodoxy. You've never heard another point of view. All it takes is one tiny pinprick for the light to come in. And you don't know what's out there. You don't have all the answers. All you know is suddenly you know that you have been lied to. And that's the first place you have to start. You know, I have an expression, the first time you think is the last time you're a Democrat.
Bravo, Evan. We have a lot of questions from the audience, great ones. This is a very thoughtful question from Jordan R. He says the effort to separate people follows through to the oppression of identity politics. How are people to know which identity is higher than another one in importance? For example, rape victims now have to see Jacob Blake's name on NFL helmets. Does that imply that Black Lives Matter is more important than Me Too? And it's a really thoughtful question.
That's the issue. And that's actually, you should have gotten to this point in the book already, Mitch, because I think it's fairly early, right after the title page. But supremacists have nothing in common with their fellow supremacists except their supremacism. So the white supremacists in the Democratic Party run south of old had nothing in common with their fellow white supremacists except that they were white supremacists. All right, the proletariat, the workers in Russia had nothing in common with their fellow proletariat except for the fact that they were workers. Well, the woke supremacist has nothing in common with the woke supremacist except that he's a woke supremacist. All he has is his hatred for the other. This is why it is so essential for them to gin up hatred for the other, no matter what supremacy it is. Because once that hatred, once that other has been vanquished, that supremacy has to crumble in upon itself because now they've got nothing in common with each other. And so you're actually seeing this, for example, in the LGBTQRSTUVW movement, where the women who have cervixes or cervi or whatever the plural is, and women who don't have them are actually fighting with each other for being top dog, for being the one who is the most victimized and therefore entitled to the most good, most profit, most money, most positions, better positions. There's one of the great truisms of all time is that revolutions eat their own. And in some part, we're already beginning to see that. And that is one of the most hopeful things for our ultimate victory is that they have nothing in common with each other. And they have this thing they've made up called intersectionality, where they actually do try to give mathematical values to degrees of victimhood. And it doesn't work because the illegal alien is more victimized than the Hispanic American or the Black American. Therefore, he gets the job first, but then you've got the Black Americans who are upset because the government isn't working for them. And so we've got to, once again, when you get past, when you pierce the hate, which is the atomic force of wokeism, their hate for Donald Trump blinds them to everything else about their own failures, including they will put up with rats in Baltimore. They'll put up with dead bodies in Chicago. They'll put up with infected homeless people in Los Angeles, and they'll put up with feces on the streets of San Francisco just so long as they have something to hate. And two very important things about this. One, even in fiction.
Evan, we have a lot more questions from the audience we want to get to too. So
okay, let me just get through this. Get through this. Even in fiction, Orwell understood this, that in the life of the people of Oceania that had nothing, they gave them a 2 minutes hate, where they would scream and yell and vitriol at this fictional character in order to distract them from how they were being abused by their socialist government. And it's not a coincidence that in fiction, where Orwell could have picked anybody and anything, he picked a villain with a Jewish name, Goldstein, and a typically Semitic visage. Socialism is inherently Jew-hating.
Evan, there are a couple of questions I'm going to combine. One's from Marilyn A., where she's basically admitting she's afraid to go out and put a sign on her lawn or express her opinions without fear of retribution. And then Ken L. also says, like, how do we change people's minds if they don't want to change their minds? Actually, that's actually coming from Hazel. How do we get people to listen to the truth if they don't want to?
Yeah, typically what happens is, A, they do want to. They've just never heard any competing point of view. I mean, it's almost like being in Russia, where they know Pravda isn't telling them the truth, but that's all they hear. That's all they hear. And they are. I know those stories of the kids in the university today who listen to Jordan Peterson underneath their blankets with their headphones on, who watch Ben Shapiro on their handheld device, on their phone, with the volume all the way down so their roommate doesn't hear it. They are hungering. They are thirsting for it. Not the true believers, not the Marxists, not that 10% I talked about earlier that are the true believers of any movement. But the other 90% are saying to themselves, well, if this isn't true, why aren't the conservatives telling me? Well, we know why, because we try and we don't own mass communication. But that's, again, why we have to be one person at a time, having the guts. And to answer the first question, once you recognize that this is war, this is an existential war, and things aren't going to get better for you if they win. And so as afraid as you are, you don't think my father was afraid to go over to Europe? You don't think our grandparents were afraid to fight the battles they fought? You don't think, and they were actually risking enemy armies. They were giving up years of their lives. You've got to be willing, once you recognize that it is war, to make the sacrifices of war. And by the way, the sacrifices that are being asked of us, what, your neighbors are going to stop talking to you? What, they're going to slash your tires? I mean, some really bad things. But to not do it, to appease them, to ghettoize ourselves, to do what it is they want us to do, they're never going to be satisfied until the final solution. Sorry to use a pointed example, but there is no middle ground with a globalist, socialist, supremacist movement, whether that globalist, socialist movement is Hitler's, whether it's Stalin's, whether it's Lenin's, whether it's Mao's, or whether it's Kim Jong-un's. There is no compromise. So it's fight them now or fight them later. You got to fight them now.
Excellent stuff, Evan. We have a really great question from Paul D. The mindset of the generation that Evan is speaking about is taught in our schools at all levels. Anything we can do to change the far left mentality being the only train of thought to be taught in all of our schools?
Look, the president is trying within the legal constitutional way, the framework. So he's going to be cutting off funding to the schools and pressuring them in any and all ways that he can. I suspect people, a good many people, a good number of the people who side with the left do so because they've made a cost-benefit analysis. I don't mean they sat there with pen and paper, but in their minds, they know that to teach conservative values comes with a high cost. You're going to be ridiculed, you're going to be threatened, you're going to lose your job, etc., and very few benefits. Whereas coming from the left, you get all the benefits, tenure with no risk, with no cost. I mean, I wonder how much Jimmy Kimmel would still be promoting the leftist narratives on his late night talk show if he weren't punished for the time that he treated Donald Trump in a humane fashion as a guest on the show. We have to alter that cost benefit equation, not just at the university and junior high school and high school level, but across all professions and all areas of life. We've got to make it more uncomfortable for them to lie about us and make it more profitable, and I don't just mean in money, for them to stand up for what's good and right and true. And that might be going out of your way to make sure if you have an open position to hire somebody who shares our values, just like they do. They hire people only who share their leftist beliefs. At some point, you know, I'm always leery of saying this, but look, they took over the schools at gunpoint. They harassed and harangued speakers on college campuses. It might take returning, fire with fire. And this is one thing Alinsky recognized as well. You know, good is always at a disadvantage against evil because good is constrained by its goodness. And this is something Alinsky recognized when he made one of the rules for radicals to make the other side live up to their playbook, up to their rule book. When our rule book is the Bible, when our rule book is the Constitution, those to whom nothing is sacred, nothing is beyond the pale, have an advantage over us. And you got to realize that in times of war, you do things that you wouldn't do in times of peace. And I think it might come to us having to return fire with fire.
Evan, we have another question from the audience. This one is about the police. And this is Ken L. And his concern is, how do we restore the image of the police? And I'll add to that, how do we restore safety for our own police? They're being hit from behind. There are a lot of people in our audience that are big supporters of the police, but how do we turn this around?
And by the way, the biggest supporters of the police are the communities where they're most needed. Again, this is rich white kids going in, as Alinsky said, they must go in and rub raw the sores of discontent. So their policy isn't, and take CNN, for example. When CNN falsely reports the Michael Brown story and does so day in and day out, long after they know the truth, they are chucking journalistic standards. They are chucking moral standards because they live by the code of Alinsky. They believe their job is to rub raw the swords of discontent. Why do you think in half a century of near total control in Democratic Party-run cities, the Democrats have done nothing to help their constituents? because they don't want to help their constituents. They need their constituents to A, be dependent on the government, because that's what socialism is. B, they need their vote, and by being dependent, they can more count. And C, hopefully their discontents will be rubbed so raw they will join the violent revolution. So when Christopher Cuomo and Don Lemon sit there on television, cameras rolling, they are talking to the camera, they're talking to each other, and they say the violence has to stop because the polls are bad for Biden, because the focus groups are saying, not because morally, not because they want what's best for the Black community, but just for the next couple of weeks until Biden gets elected, the violence has to stop. So how do we restore faith in the police? It's not the people in the inner city who don't have faith in the police. Polling over and over and over and over again shows they want more police, right? It's again the rich, white, pampered, middle class, suburban housewife and her kids that are the ones who ill regard the police. And how do you do it? I guess just a little bit at a time.
Evan, thank you so much for being with us today. You were amazing as always. Just want to let you know that we have posted links for your book here. And so people will be able to get more information, and we'll post it in other places as well.
May I very quickly, I'm sorry, sir. Do I have 2 seconds to just make a very quick pitch? This is not just another book. It's being lauded by Dinesh D'Souza, by the intelligence community. This is the next book you buy. I see that there are 117 people still left in the room. I expect 117 sales by the time I get downstairs. Okay.
Well, thank you, Evan. We want to let everybody know that also next week is September 11th. We have a special treat. We're going to be having Newt Gingrich on. Newt is in Italy because his wife is the ambassador to the Vatican. So we'll be 8:30 a.m. Pacific Daylight Time with Newt, and that should be exciting. If you want more information about the Jewish Republican Alliance, you need to go to our website, jewishrepublicanalliance.org, become a member, make a donation of any kind so you can help us continue our fight. We're here to give you the ammunition you need to be able to make a difference out there and let people know the truth. We're uniting and energizing conservatives to take action, and we want you to take action. You can hear all of our past shows and watch them on our YouTube channel. You can go to our Facebook page. You can go to our Instagram page. We're all over the place, and we're putting out very essential information for you to hear and to see, and we need your support. So until we meet again, we thank you all for being here. We wish you a great 3-day weekend, a peaceful Shabbat. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Bye-bye.
Shabbat Shalom. Thank you, Evan.